to the ADHD Unfiltered podcast, episode 5. Today is going to be a very special Q&A where I'll answer your questions that you've asked me. And I'm Cherry, by the way. And usually I also have a co-host with me, Emma. She's really, really lovely, but unfortunately she's unwell. So it's just going to be me today. Nonetheless, that enabled me to do a little bit of a special. So I asked you guys what questions you'd like to have answered. And without further ado, and just before I forget, this podcast all around is about ADHD, about being authentic and real with the experiences of having ADHD, having late diagnosed ADHD, but then also giving you some knowledge and strategies to hopefully, one, make you feel less alone, but two, make you feel a little bit empowered as well. Sorry, this is my cat. She wants to chip in as well. And the very first question, or actually the first few questions that I was asked quite a bit was, one, how do I get diagnosed with ADHD? How do I know if I have ADHD or if it's just post-kids chaos in my life? I had symptoms earlier, but no chaos. And then lastly, why do so many people relate to ADHD symptoms? So with those questions, I wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit about ADHD symptoms in general, and actually the ADHD diagnostic criteria as well, because basically I think the reason why so many people with ADHD or even without ADHD, so many people in general relate to ADHD symptoms is that, one, now it is shown by actual lived experience rather than just reading it on paper and not really knowing how that might relate to everyday life. Because I, for example, sometimes I would have read a symptom or a struggle and I would have been like, no, that doesn't really relate to me, until I've actually looked into it further. And then I was like, oh, so this is actually how it shows up. So one, that might be one of the reasons why so many people now relate to ADHD symptoms. But two, a lot of these struggles and symptoms that we have with ADHD, they will very well be experienced by people without ADHD. And that is because we have those difficulties on a much higher frequency and intensity scale than neurotypical people might have them. So let's take as an example forgetting appointments. Forgetfulness is a big symptom with ADHD and can very negatively impact your life, and it really does if you have undiagnosed and untreated ADHD. But if if you don't have ADHD, you will sometimes forget some things. Sometimes you will forget to take something important with you. Sometimes you'll forget an appointment, okay? But you won't have that symptom happening every single day or multiple times a day. There will be every single day in my life there's been something that I've forgotten, whether that's something important to take with me, whether that's a phone call that I needed to make, whether that's an email I needed to respond to, whether that's a text message that I haven't responded to, whether that's, an important document I should have filled in, whether that's opening letters. I could go on and on and on. And I mean, in school, that even showed up for me already very, very quickly by consistently pretty much forgetting books with me. So I had to take books to school with me that we should, have with us. It was kind of like a necessity, really. And I never really took them with me. And if I did, I wouldn't have all my books with me. I'd always forget at least one, or I'd have none of them, or I'd forget to take pens with me to school or paper, that those really like kind of very necessary things, very important things. So basically, if you do relate to ADHD symptoms that you see on social media, make sure that you check in with yourself. How frequent do I experience these symptoms? One. And then 2, how intense, like how much do they actually impact my life? How intense do I feel this? So for example, you might also relate to having difficulties to get started with tasks that you might be dreading. Okay, so with ADHD, there is, for example, a difficulty with, quote unquote, motivation. And I'm saying that as such because we don't actually lack as such a motivation, but it might feel like a lack of motivation because actually, in reality, is executive dysfunction impacting us and our ability to prioritize, order, and then start and finish tasks, really. But so therefore, if you've got tasks to do, it can feel quite overwhelming then to, get started. You might not know exactly where to start. You might have too much information and it feels too overwhelming to know exactly how to sort the information in your head, etc. And so you will very well want to get started with a task, but you don't quite know where and how, and that makes you almost feel paralyzed. So you'll instead probably procrastinate by doing other things instead, or you'll just be pretty much exactly paralyzed on the couch and think about the million different things in your head that you can't even pinpoint exactly because you've got like probably 180 miles per hour of overlapping thoughts in your head, which is what it feels like for me pretty much actually all of the times, because I've got also a hyperactive mind. But if you are neurotypical, for example, you might just not be motivated to do a task. And, don't get me wrong, there are times where I just do not want to do something and I feel a little bit lazy. But the way that I can very well distinguish not being motivated to do something with ADHD paralysis and actually having that ADHD overwhelm from executive dysfunction is by checking in, how does it feel? Can I imagine doing the task? And if I think about the task and it feels like this tornado of thoughts, then I know exactly it's ADHD paralysis, it's overwhelm and executive dysfunction. Whereas if I know exactly what to do and how to start, then it's more likely just that I don't want to do it. So for example, let's say there is something spilled on the floor. I know exactly what to do. I need to get something and I need to wipe it off, and I do not feel overwhelmed. That's a very, very, very big thing. I do not feel overwhelmed by the thought of doing that. And it literally just is that I just can't be asked to move. Then that's probably not ADHD related in that moment, despite that obviously, you can't just switch on and off ADHD. It'll probably just be more a lack of motivation. Whereas most of the times, if I've got tasks to do where they're kind of lower on my priority list, because basically ADHD brains are driven by the constant need for dopamine. And it's not actually a lack of dopamine that we have, but basically we just use dopamine quicker than neurotypical brains. So basically we lack therefore a dopamine pretty much constantly, but it's because we use it up quicker. So even like rewards, or kind of like the dopamine that we get from kind of completing tasks, or from, dopamine inducing tasks such as, tasks of interest. That dopamine will be quite short-lived because that's the way our brain is wired. It just uses this up very, very quickly. So let's talk a little bit actually about the diagnostic criteria, because, not many, whilst you might see a lot of kind of symptoms that you relate to, not all of them will be diagnostic criteria. They might be related to the diagnostic criteria, but not as such, if that makes sense. I hope it does. So, the very first thing that I would advise you to do is, if you think you might have ADHD, literally Google ASRS. Yeah. Sorry. That was my cat trying to knock over my phone. Anyway. Right. Okay. So, the ASRS is the Adult ADHD Self-Report Scale, and it's been actually thought to be about 95% accurate in accurately predicting whether someone has got ADHD or not. Now, the 5% left over here is obviously because there is a big symptom overlap of ADHD, and also you will have needed to have that in childhood as well. So it can very well be that you score high on this test but still not have ADHD because you actually only developed those symptoms in the last few years, and there were none of these present during your childhood years. Or maybe it's actually just it's a combination of other symptoms, and we will talk about the misdiagnoses and different kind of conditions that can mirror ADHD symptoms. But generally speaking, this is quite accurate. So the very first, there's two parts to this questionnaire. There's a part A and a part B. The part A is exactly the diagnostic criteria. So if you hit often or very often in these things, there is a high probability that you have ADHD. And the part B section is really just then to figure out whether you have hyperactive ADHD, whether you have inattentive ADHD, or whether you have combined ADHD, so hyperactive and inattentive ADHD together. So let's ask some of these questions. Part A, question 1, is how often do you have trouble wrapping up the final details of a project once the challenging parts have been done? For me, that's very often. I will often, it's so frustrating. just the thought of it. I'll sometimes, for example, I don't even know where to start. Just the amount of things that So let's say I started with a project, right? For example, in university, that was my dissertation. I mean, the actual starting part was difficult already. But once I got going and the challenging bits were done, for example, finding all the kind of different studies and collecting data, etc., I couldn't then get that wrapped up and just transcribe the data, for example. So for my dissertation, just to give you a little bit of background, I had to interview some people about questions, and then I had to transcribe that data, and I just couldn't get myself to finish that off. I would transcribe it, but then I just couldn't just kind of perfect it, if that makes sense. So kind of check for mistakes, spelling errors, etc. It just felt so impossible, because there's literally nothing rewarding about this, because I've done the hard bit, I've done the hard work. The very, very last 5% of doing this thing just feels I can't describe it anymore. Or for example, laundry. I mean, I will have washed and dried laundry, but then actually folding and putting it away, it takes me weeks to do that. So just to give you some examples of what that might actually look like. But there will be many, many other ones, I'm sure, that will come to me. But that's another thing. When I'm asked an open question, I can't very well or very quickly think about examples on the spot, and I'll be in my head. Anyway. Question 2. How often do you have difficulty getting things in order when you have to do a task that requires organization? I mean, every time. So I click very often because that's like literally, that's the most frequent time that you can click. So basically, let's think about a very frequent example of trying to write down my to-do list, and actually ordering that in terms of prioritization is a task in itself. It's a big thing that has been taking a lot of time to kind of practice, and it's still not quite there. Same with documents. If I have to like fill in documents and then like actually hand in some like documents with that document, it's, oh my God. I just get, it's awful. And I think you can't really describe that to people unless they know what it feels like. Yeah. It's hard. It just feels like this impossible thing of a big, overwhelming task. And the thing is, often these things, they will take probably like 5 or 10 minutes, but they feel in my head like a big black wall, actually. Like there's like this block where I just can't see past it. I just can't see how to possibly get it done. And then at some point I will box through that wall somehow with a sense of urgency and impending late fines or fees or whatever, which usually have happened at that point anyway. And I'll box through it and I'll be like, wow, this actually just took me 5 minutes and it wasn't really that hard. And still, every single time something like that comes up, it'll feel just as hard again. Number 3, how often do you have problems remembering appointments or obligations? I mean, that one pretty much speaks for itself, but I kind of touched upon that already. So it might not just be that you forget about appointments. It could also be forgetting about making a phone call, writing an email, doing something that needed to be done, such as, checking your car in for an MOT, or passing your partner your car keys because, I went off with the car keys once. So my partner, he was driving an electric car, and I had the car keys in my handbag. He dropped me off and I didn't pass him the car keys. So that meant he was stuck and I didn't check my phone. That was not good. Happens very, very, very often, pretty much on a daily basis for me. It can also be just small things, quote unquote, such as, for example, getting something from the shops. So number 4, question 4 is, when you have a task that requires a lot of thought, how often do you avoid or delay getting started? And I mean, I kind of touched upon that already, but for me, it's very often. I didn't even know that was a thing that people would not struggle with, or could not struggle with. And that one was for me like just absolutely mind blown that was a big thing for ADHD. And it is. It's literally one of the diagnostic criteria things. Number 5, how often do you fidget or squirm with your hands or feet when you have to sit down for a long time? I do it constantly. I do it right now. I often talk, therefore, also with my hands, and people will be like, why do you talk with your hands so much? It's because it's an outlet, okay? It makes me be able to actually focus a little bit better on what I'm trying to say, and also on, kind of following through with what I'm trying to say, because that's another thing, organizing your thoughts and actually putting them out in a cohesive, in a coherent, I don't know what the word is. Thank you. They're exactly that it is. It's really, really difficult. So there are actually speech and language related difficulties with ADHD. If you didn't know, I'm also a speech and language therapist. So we did touch upon that within university, but ever since finding out that I've got ADHD, I kind of obviously researched into it a little bit more. And it makes a lot of sense. And I'm more than happy to talk about that a little bit more in detail. But right now it's probably too much. Number 6, lost track. How very typical. Anyway, number 6, how often do you feel overly active and compelled to do things like you were driven by a motor? And this question, I didn't quite understand at first. But let me just relate that to you. It's basically if you look around and you, for example, you have something to do, but then you suddenly have the intense urge to reorganize the house. That is pretty much that. Or you have the intense urge to research and go down a rabbit hole around something that is popped into your head. Or let's say, true story, you clear out the entire car suddenly, which is something that you've put off for ages, but you're already running late, and there's literally, it makes absolutely no sense why you would do that in that moment in time, but I just cannot stop it. I'll just be there and I'm like, yes, I'm finally sorting out the car. I know I'm running late and I should definitely not be doing this. I should be rushing off right now, but this feels too urgent and too impossible to stop. And true story from the other day. So yeah, that's just the part A. So if you've hit the options were never, rarely, sometimes, often, and very often, if you have clicked very often, or kind of said to, not clicked, in your head very often, then you should definitely check out the ASRS further. Because, yeah. Then just to kind of talk a little bit more about the DSM-5 criteria for diagnosis of ADHD in adults, because yes, this was a questionnaire, but it didn't actually talk about the symptoms in itself. So they have to, so this is literally from the DSM-5, right? So 5 or more symptoms per category in adults persisting at least 6 months. They have to have been present prior to the age of 12, and several symptoms are present in more or 2 or more settings. Then furthermore, symptoms interfere with or reduce the quality of social, academic, or occupational functioning. So basically they have an impact on your ability to socialize, your friendships, your relationships, your school, your work life, those sort of things. And I do not want you to misunderstand the functioning of the academic or work functioning, because I actually performed quite well in the end with grades for school, because I was incredibly good at last minute cramming and studying. But the amount of stress that is caused me is, one, immense. I mean, I literally was in and out of therapy for ages for anxiety and depression. But 2, I would often cram all the material in literally within 5 minutes. Then it'll be blurted out on paper. And then afterwards, I'd just forget it. It'd just be like a clean slate in my brain. And, that's not very handy, is it? Not to mention the amounts of difficulties I've had otherwise at school is a lot. There was obviously the difficulty of forgetfulness. I'd lose things. I'd often blurt out answers. I'd often ask for toilet breaks, even if I didn't need to use the toilet, because I had the intense urge to move. I'd often zone out involuntarily multiple times within an hour, and I'd lose track of what has been said, what's been done. I really struggled with note taking and listening at the same time. And I was like, how does everyone do it? This is just infuriating. And I'd get migraines from trying so hard to focus the entire times. to the extent that I had so many sick days. It would literally impact on my physical well-being as well as my emotional well-being. I had tests done and everything for my migraines, and I'd also had tests done actually for zoning out, and turned out I had ADHD. But that was a big issue for me for a long time, and it still is. Those things don't just resolve itself. You just start to kind of acknowledge them. You start to become aware of when those symptoms impact you the most and how. And then you try and find ways to work with those difficulties or around them even. And that's another thing. You start to kind of like try and figure out what your strengths are as well. And so you try and work one symptom against the other, almost kind of. Anyway, to talk a little bit more. Oh, and then also with occupational functioning or with a work one is my job resume is so ridiculously long, I'd often shorten it. It's honestly, I can't even count the amount of jobs that I've had. And it's not because I was fired, because actually I was really, really good at every single job I've ever done, because when I start a job, I'll be literally in hyperfocus. I'll be full on masking as well. And I'll be so good until I get so burnt out. And then I lose that hyperfocus of, being able to really kind of give my all onto that job, and that dopamine rush is gone, and then I'll be looking for the next job, and then so I've bounced a lot from job to job, but at least it's given me a vast variety of experience in different areas. But basically, for the DSM-5 criteria of symptoms is one, inattention. So you lack attention to details or careless mistakes. So that might mean you, for example, I don't know, you try and pour a coffee for someone and you forget that they didn't want milk in their coffee, for example. So those kind of little mistakes or lack of attention to details. But then it could also be further. For example, in emails, I'll often have like some errors, or in assignments, I'd overread or I didn't read actually very important bits to the way that this assignment should be done, and then obviously I'd get marked down on it because I literally missed part of the instructions. So just some different ways of how that might show up. Then difficulty sustaining attention in tasks. So you basically get distracted very frequently and start multiple tasks at once, and you have difficulties controlling that. Okay. So then next, you do not seem to listen when spoken to directly, and that's a tricky one because I actually also struggle with making direct eye contact when I'm speaking, or when people are speaking to me and I'm trying to really, really take in what they're saying. It's because when I do make eye contact, I'll get so distracted by the eye contact that anything that they're saying is just literally like going through. I can't process what they're saying as well. So I'll make fleeting eye contact whilst I'm communicating. But often that might actually look like I'm not actually listening when I am actually really listening, and vice versa. When I am looking like I'm really, really listening, I'm probably not. And then also sometimes I'll literally just zone out. I call them my little brain breaks, where I'll just stare into nothingness for, I don't know, sometimes like a few minutes, and it is the most peaceful my brain feels. And I hate being interrupted in those. Number or D, does not follow through on instructions. So I kind of touched upon that already. It's actually a working memory difficulty of being able to take in all different instructions at the same time, but then also process it from a language point of view. So it's kind of like a multiple difficulty area sort of thing. And it's almost funny because as a speech and language therapist, I used to work with adults in within adult neurology, and part of the way of trying to improve their ability to understand and take in information was to give them instructions and see if they could follow them all. And to be honest, some of these I would have failed if I hadn't been the person assessing them. It made me feel like a little bit, like a hypocrite, to be honest. And it made me actually look into executive dysfunction further, and also working memory difficulties, etc. with ADHD. Then next is you also avoid tasks that require sustained mental effort. So anything where you have to focus for a long period of time, like, for example, meetings or writing a long email, filling in documents, all those things for me require sustained mental effort. Not for everyone. For some people that might be easy, and something else might require sustained mental effort, and you'll avoid doing that. Then you also lose and misplace objects. I mean, I've done that so many times. I was actually told off so often by people around me, telling me that I don't take care well enough of things, and that I must not care about them or about the objects, and that I should not be ever trusted with anything important because I'll just lose it or misplace it. And it was really, really hurtful, because I was generally always so upset about losing those things, because they were often important things. Let's just say passports. I mean, the amount of times that I've misplaced them, and I'll put them in a safe spot, and I'll joke about it, but it is quite serious. For me, a safe spot, I'll put it in a safe spot, and I'll be like, right, I know exactly where it is. But the funny thing about safe spots is they're so safe that they're even safe for me. Like, I have no idea where it's gone. I'm also easily distracted, or you're also easily distracted. That's another symptom in the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria. You're forgetful in daily activities. Again, you'll forget to do certain tasks. You forget to put ingredients in or buy like main ingredients from the shops. You might forget to do certain things from your to-do list, or there's so many different ways that you can be forgetful, or you'll forget to respond to a friend. I mean, I'm just recalling like the most frequent or most recent ways that these have shown up for me, but I know there's obviously different ways that these can show up. The next one is for hyperactivity and impulsivity. The way that those can show up is 1, fidgeting with hands and feet and squirming in the seat. I mean, I'm literally, as I'm speaking to you right now, I'm fidgeting with my foot and my hands. Then you leave the seat frequently. For me, that means I actually move around on the seat a lot. I won't stay in one position for ages unless I'm hyperfixated on something, but then I literally forget to eat and drink and use the toilet. Then you also often feel restless, and that's a big one actually. Having one, not only physical restlessness, but also mental restlessness. Like, I'll often feel extremely tired, but my brain will still be going at it. Then you're also unable to engage in leisure activities quietly. So you might make, I would refer to them as, some vocal stims, for example. You might talk to yourself. You might make some noises like, or those little, or you might make up a song about it. I'd love making up random songs, to be honest. Or just random bits like that. Just to name a few. There's many, many more. Then the next one is you're always on the go and you have got difficulties being still for extended times. And the way that this shows up for me is that I've got internalized hyperactivity of the brain. So for me, there's always something to do. I might not always be able to execute that because of executive dysfunctioning. So it doesn't always look like I'm on the go, but there will be some days that are where just some weeks actually I just jam-pack myself so full with things and being constantly on the go. And I joke about it, but I make my life harder by just fully overestimating my capacity to do things and be active, and then I'll be burnt out for months sometimes afterwards. You also talk excessively. I mean, I've been talking now for 36 minutes. But that was a big one. My parents would joke that I started speaking late, and I never shut up since. Kindly said. I know they love me, but yeah. You also blurt out answers all the time. You might also finish people's sentences. You might have difficulties waiting your turn, whether that's, in conversations of interrupting people, or whether that's actually, waiting your turn of doing something. I often actually have difficulties with that still. And the very last one is you interrupt or intrude on others. And the way that this is shown up for me very, very excessively is that I know my partner is busy and doing something work related, and I still cannot help myself but ask him a question or interrupt him or kind of like almost intrude on that task. And it's now that I'm aware of that this ADHD related, I'm able to, one, feel less bad about myself and as a human being, but two, he's also a little bit more understanding. And I've been able to kind of try and use other ways of trying to engage my brain otherwise so I don't intrude. And we've now got a little strategy of, well, ask him, oh, are you busy right now? Before I kind of start with what I'm saying. And that's actually really helped. So just those little things, little tweaks here and there. And I'm very well aware that this was supposed to be a Q&A, and I've mainly just talked about symptoms of ADHD. But I do feel nonetheless that this is really, really important to kind of talk about a little bit more. And, there is also obviously a big symptom overlap between ADHD and autism. I mean, I think 50% to 70% of people with autism also fit the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, which is, massive. But then there's also a big overlap between ADHD and anxiety and CPTSD. So if you feel like you've got ADHD, there is a reason why often specialists will have to diagnose that. And yeah, there was also a question asked if there's any benefit of getting a diagnosis as an adult if you don't want to go on medication. And also another question was, I'm 39 and I've only recently realized that I very likely have ADHD after researching. So I'm just wondering if there's any point seeking an official diagnosis at my age. I highly, highly recommend seeking a diagnosis still. And I was actually 23 when I found out that I was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 6. So it is a little bit different. But I first was like, well, there's no point now. I'm doing fine. I mean, it hasn't clearly impacted me so much. But then I didn't really look into it, actually. I didn't really know that just the amount of how it impacted me. And then I just kind of pushed it aside because I was like, oh, it's fine, what difference does it make now anyway? And then I became a mum and symptoms got exaggerated because actually as your responsibilities increase, so do your difficulties, or more, they become much more apparent because you are less able to continuously mask and keep up that effort of masking your difficulties. And with masking, I don't mean just kind of overplaying them, but actually we overcompensate a lot of the times for masking. So for example, some people are like, oh, well, I'm not late for appointments. Do I still have ADHD? I'm actually always early. And with ADHD, you can either be chronically late or just way too early, or you're both, because you'll be trying to overcompensate so much for the fact that you're always running late that you're suddenly now 30 minutes early, or, well, in my case, a week early sometimes for appointments. And then the actual appointments I'll miss. But that's another one. Or you'll stay up all night to finish up an assignment that you forgot to do. And so you overcompensate for those difficulties. And as your responsibilities increase, it becomes more and more problematic and less possible to maintain that without completely burning yourself out to the ground. And I mean, people with ADHD are 3 times more likely to suffer burnout as well. Not to mention that ADHD burnout is also a little bit different than normal burnout as well, and can often be mistaken actually with depression. And the up and down of the energy that you have with ADHD is also often mistaken with bipolar, by the way. But nonetheless, you can also often have obviously overlapping conditions. You can be depressed and have ADHD. You can have anxiety and have ADHD. You can have bipolar and have ADHD. But it is important to have the right distinct diagnoses so you get the right treatment and the right support. And now for the question of whether you can do that without medication. I'm currently not medicated. I was medicated briefly as a child. I'm not medicated right now. I have been thinking about medicating on and off, but at the moment I manage. Yes, I still have my difficulties. Absolutely, they do not go away. But there are different ways of managing ADHD. There is the dietary supplements, which I'm taking and which have a relatively good evidence base behind them. There is therapy. I've gone to therapy myself. There's no shame in that. And I honestly believe that is massively helped me. But it really, really depended on the therapist for me and how knowledgeable they were on neurodivergence as well. And sometimes, they'll help with the mental health related difficulties. I mean, you are at an increased risk of having anxiety and depression, for example, if you have ADHD. And they've definitely helped with that, but they might not actually help with the ADHD difficulties itself. And for that, ADHD coaching is amazing. That's literally, trying to figure out what strategies help you on a daily basis to work around and with your ADHD. And then also a big one for me was self-compassion, reparenting myself in the way of teaching myself how to regulate my emotions effectively and how to not impulsively say things that I might regret later on. And kind of using more holistic ways here of coping. So there, and the next one is exercise. Exercise is a big one, and it will look different to everybody. But at the moment, I've been able to finally get into a somewhat regular exercise routine, and it does really help. And I've noticed a difference on the days that I haven't exercised a lot, actually. And there was another question of asking, is every person with ADHD untidy, and does every ADHD house have to be a mess? No, absolutely not. There are some people who are incredibly great at tidying and at, maintaining a clean house. I mean, there's a wonderful woman who's helped me sort out my house, and she's got ADHD. And it depends where your hyperfocus lies, where your interests lie. ADHD will look differently in everyone. Absolutely. There are big similarities across us in the way that, we will have difficulties, but just in different topics, for example. So you might not have difficulties with organizing your house, but you might instead have difficulties organizing your calendar, your appointments, your documents, your letters, those sort of things. Or you might have difficulties in both. Or you just absolutely overcompensate and actually go down the OCD route. I mean, there's been times where my house was spotless in my life. And unfortunately, as it pains me to say, that time was also the time that I struggled with my mental health the most. And the thing, I think there's a big misconception as well of people thinking that people with ADHD don't want to have a tidy house, which is completely wrong. We want it to be clean and tidy. We massively benefit from a clean and tidy and decluttered environment because there is less clutter than kind of cluttering our brain as well, and less kind of constant to-do lists and chores and distractions that just pop up visually and then into your head. But we struggle with doing it. We struggle with maintaining a tidy and clean house and knowing exactly how to declutter all the kind of impulse purchases that you've made, because you also have difficulties with making decisions, which is also another ADHD thing. So there is a big, a big spectrum of things, I guess. And the last one that I really wanted to answer was, does living in a bad environment result in developing ADHD? No, it does not. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition, and that means you will have been born with it, and symptoms become apparent from the age of 4 earliest, 3 or 4, I think was the earliest. The earliest you can get assessed actually is 4. But it becomes really apparent around the age of 6 and 7, because that's the time that you go to school and you suddenly you have all those additional pressures, where, and then also developmentally, where you might have different difficulties that you might not be expected to have anymore. And the way, actually, there's them saying, oh, does living in a bad environment result in developing ADHD? So one, no, it does not, because you will have had it as a child. But what sometimes, and where there is a big overlap, is between ADHD and PTSD, or more CPTSD. So there can be a big symptom overlap, and it is really, really important to obviously distinguish them both to get accurately treated and the right help. But that's not to say you can also have CPTSD and ADHD, because often actually there's a lot of studies saying that just living undiagnosed can and often does result in trauma. So yeah, I hope that this helped. Next week we are back with Emma and me, and we have some very, very exciting guests coming up, and we'll have we're planning and hoping that there'll be bi-weekly episodes with guests. I'm sorry if this was, if this, maybe didn't cover everything. I tried my best to talk about every kind of symptom and well, I probably didn't talk about every symptom, but as I said, there's only so much time that I have. So without further ado, I hope this has helped, and let me know if you've got any more questions. There is always a Q&A at the end of every episode as well. This one was just a much longer and detailed one. So yeah, bye-bye.